Welcome back to Control Alt Lead, the podcast where we talk to IT leaders about what is moving in the market. Back in September, Amazon CEO Andy Jassy ordered all staff back to work 5 days a week, which was not a popular move, but he reasoned that while productivity had remained strong in the era of remote work, innovation had suffered. So, to talk all about that, this week I'm joined for the very first time by two guests, Mark Ridley and Andrew MacLaren. As well as being co hosts of the Teamcraft podcast, Mark is a fractional CTO and Andrew is a lecturer at Heriot-Watt University in Scotland. Through the podcast, we talk about why tech firms are now forcing staff back to the office, why hybrid working might not be the great middle ground you think it is, and why those return to office mandates could be a really good thing for companies here in the UK. Enjoy. Mark, Andrew, thanks so much for joining me today. We've got one IT professional on the call and one academic. I will let you both introduce yourselves and the readers can decide which is which.
Who do you want
Mark,
to go first?
let's start with you,
All
Mark.
right. Thanks, Tom. Well, and thanks for having me back. So some people may have heard me on here before. I'm Mark Ridley. I'm effectively a consulting CTO. So my entire career has effectively been in tech. And I spend most of my time working in and around the CTO role with a variety of different businesses. So I was the tech co-founder of read.co.uk, and I've worked with businesses like the Financial Times, some music businesses and fintech businesses.
Great. Thanks, Mark. And Andrew, over to you.
Hi, I'm Andrew MacLaren. I'm a researcher. I work at Heriot-Watt University in Edinburgh. I'm Associate Professor of Team Communication, and my kind of area of interest is language and teamwork. So I do research in a few different areas: team decision making for investment, long distance communication for space exploration, training for healthcare workers, specifically doctors, and various other things. Anything to do with teams talking to each other, I'm interested in it.
Great, thanks. And that's exactly what we're here to talk about today, because Amazon, of course, just very recently announced a big return to office mandate. So that's the main sort of cut and thrust of the podcast today. I want to start with why that's happening, and it's happening across the tech space. It was pretty commonly accepted back in 2020 all the way through to 2022 that working from home was more productive. So why in the last 2 years are we seeing a shift back to the office, and not just like a hey, come back to the office, it's really good here, but you will come back to the office?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question, something that we've looked at a lot, and I think the reason that it has effectively become a three-line whip or become a mandate that has gone out is because that's what it needs to be in order to get the results that the leaders want. So the people that are mandating it are not seeing the take up, the optional take up from people. So the very simple reason they are saying you have to do it is because people weren't listening to the could you do it, please? So that's why it is a mandate. I think the much more interesting part under that is why are they making that demand when there was some evidence that that remote work and virtual work was better? You mentioned about being more productive. I think there are probably challenges to that, and actually we can come on to this. Andrew and I work together on some research around teams particularly, and we've picked up some really interesting research, an article that was put out actually by AWS on exactly this topic, where they actually proposed adaptive work is probably the right solution. Don't just demand one thing. And obviously we've seen Andy Jassy fly in the face of the research that was actually AWS and Stanford University researchers. In that was it was some really thoughtful work that was done in that research paper, and there are loads of researchers that Andrew knows much better than I do who have talked about the productivity of remote work. But even if you question the productivity part of it, there was definitely a part where employees felt significant benefits of being able to work at least in a hybrid fashion. So without standing up to cohorts of users next to each other and saying that Group A is more productive than Group B, I think it's very obvious that there was a very, very positive impact in employee morale and retention. But then there's been really vocal criticism from people like Eric Schmidt, who obviously is no longer with Google, but suggesting that Google's growth had stunted because they were no longer co-present.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
Andy Jassy, in his original email, which I think was a really well-crafted piece of executive comms, although the message I might disagree with, when I look back at what he wrote, he was very clear about what the reason for going back into the office was, and it wasn't productivity, it was innovation. So when Andy Jassy said it, he was making the point that culture is really important to us. We have to prioritize culture, and innovation is extremely difficult. This was his contention. Innovation is extremely difficult if you're not co-present. I don't necessarily agree with all of those things, but looking through the chain, I can understand why he did it, and I can also appreciate the quality of the message that he sent, even if I don't agree with the message.
Okay. Andrew, I'll come over to you then. So Mark contends that innovation and culture and productivity are linked but perhaps separate. Would you agree with that? And would you say that that is a provable, concrete benefit to have everyone back in the office?
I like how you're pitting Mark and me against each other. So nice. So I would dial back slightly and say, I think one of the slight misconceptions in the way that the whole debate ends up being expressed is that the virtual work that we've been doing is good. So this idea, so like Andy Jassy's announcement saying all these great things happen when we're co-located, so we're going back to the office. Virtual work doesn't work for that. There is a sort of implicit suggestion that the virtual work that was being done was really highly effective virtual work, and we've got it all nailed down, and the way the operating approaches that we have when we're working virtually together are commensurate with how good we are when we're co-present. And the reality is that there's a huge amount of heavy lifting that is done by co-located work simply because we've done it for generations, and the built environment around us, the operating procedures, the way in which we're used to communicating with each other, all of those things become somewhat implicit. So we don't have to think about them, and they feel easy, and therefore we do it well and it feels good. Everything about virtual work is to a greater or lesser extent new. And I do think there's a little bit of a false dichotomy to sort of say, because we know we can do so well when we are face to face, that means that virtual work just isn't as good. So is it more productive? Is it better for innovation? I'd say the evidence in research is really highly mixed, and actually it's probably one of these classic academic answers to say, well, it kind of depends, because it's quite nuanced. So there's evidence that says, for example, there are certain types of creative work that lends itself to being co-present. But there's equal evidence from research that says, well, actually sometimes doing creative work, innovation type work, is better served by something like a virtual approach, because, for example, if you're trying to come up with an idea and a solution to a problem, and you get the opportunity to go away, you connect virtually, then you go away into your own corner and you think about it and you work the problem, and then you come back and you say, well, this is what I came up with, and everyone else goes around what they came up with. The evidence suggests that that's a far more equitable approach, and it's more likely that everyone will have an input, and it's more likely that everyone will have thought more thoroughly about the issue. There's a tendency in co-present problem solving like that, or innovative work, for the loudest voice in the room to monopolize the conversation. Certain other dynamics, things maybe perhaps to do with gender, take over. So that's not to say that it means that when it's in person it's bad. It's just to say we don't necessarily have great evidence of really effective virtual work that stands against the significant evidence we have of the power of in person.
So you talked a bit about the research there, Andrew, and we've covered this topic and specifically the Amazon version of the topic on computing quite extensively. And a lot of Amazon workers have sort of hit back against Andy Jassy, saying this is not the way Amazon as a company operates. It's not a data-driven decision. So you're saying that the research actually is quite mixed in terms of the benefits of being co-located or being remote.
I think I have two things that I would say to that, particularly on the example of Amazon, but there's plenty of other examples out there. Yes, the evidence is mixed. It's mixed and it's incomplete. So we don't get the opportunity to gather good data on the biggest firms in the world if they are wholesale moving back to the office and create an understanding of what really good virtual work looks like. So yes, it's definitely mixed. It's nuanced as well. And the nuance relates to my second point, and that is that it's about level of analysis. So we're talking here about organizational level decisions, everybody back to the office. But a company like Amazon, and I would venture to say most tech companies for sure, the principal unit of value through which they deliver their work is teams. And teams is a kind of meso level of analysis within the organization. My analogy is this. You can have a mandate like Amazon have that says, okay, everybody back to the office full time. That's how we operate now. The reality of how that would translate for individual teams, which is the unit of value through which you deliver your proposition to the world, your market value, the translation of that might just not work. So my analogy is, if the Navy were to say, right, we are going back to our roots. We are 100% a seafaring organization. We operate on boats or ships, more likely. We operate on floating things. Everybody back to the boats. What does the Army Air Corps say? We use flying machines. This mandate doesn't work for us. I know that's a crude example, but I guarantee there will be teams in Amazon that are just saying, well, that just simply doesn't work for us. It might work for an organization. And I think if I could, put a judgment on it, I think there's a little bit of kind of C-suite bias on this as well, because I think it's very convenient when you're at C-suite level, you've got your gaze over the organization. It's very appealing to say, yeah, I'm going to take that whole variability of hybrid, virtual, in-person out of the equation, and I'm just going to mandate that we're all back in the office. That makes my view much more manageable.
Okay. You mentioned hybrid there, and I think this is something that we should definitely talk about, because it does seem to most people now to be a sort of good middle ground, say 2 or 3 days in the office and then Mondays and Fridays working from home remotely. Mark, I'll put it to you. Is that actually the case, or is that more difficult to manage from a leader point of view?
Yeah, I'll come out quite strongly on that one. No, it's not a good middle ground. And it's something that Andrew and I have discussed quite extensively, actually. And we use the phrase virtual teams to talk about this scale of teams that are anywhere from being co-present, so one step away from being co-present, all the way through to being fully remote. And one of my touchstones that I use when I'm working with teams to help them transition to a hybrid or a virtual environment is GitLab. And I've for years I found the work that Buffer and GitLab do is absolutely fascinating. When I was working at the Financial Times in 2020, when we sent everyone home for the first time, and when I was looking at how we were going to make that organization function, I drew really heavily on the work of Buffer and GitLab, because they were the best publicized, most open sources of material for a tech company about how can we actually work together. And GitLab in particular, it's larger than Buffer. I think it's several thousand people. And on exactly that point, there was a podcast recently with Sid Sibrangi, who is the founder and the current CEO of GitLab. And he made a point which I totally agree with, which is GitLab have chosen to be completely remote. And he talks through their journey of trying to be co-present in the office and remote at the same time. And that there are two good choices here: either be co-located or be remote, but don't try to be in the middle. And again, and this is really to go back to Andrew's point about we can't compare something that on face value, we're taking the fact that co-located work and remote work are our processes are equally well developed and equally mature. Most of the evidence that we have for remote work, hybrid work not working comes from the pandemic, and that was working in the pandemic, not working remotely, and there's a really big difference for it. But effectively, what I would say is that it is really difficult to sit in that middle ground, because you naturally have different classes of individuals that are working together, whether it is some of that team are mostly remote and rarely come into the office, and some people do come into the office, or people are coming in on different days. You're not actually really getting any of the benefits of co-presence. And something I think Andrew and I would both say is co-presence is extremely important, but it doesn't mean that you have to be co-present for the entire duration of your work for the entire year. So there is another way to do that we can come back to. But if you think about how to make completely remote work, you actually have to re-engineer the organization. You cannot use the processes that have worked when you are co-located and extend them out to remote working. And when you sit somewhere in the middle, it's really confusing for people. And I'm sure we've all experienced that. If you're in a meeting room and some of the team are dialing in, there's a natural difference. It would actually be substantially better if you have a remote meeting with people dialing in remotely, if everybody dialed in remotely rather than 6 of you in one meeting room and 6 people dialing in, because it's patently unfair to the people that are remote. It's not equivalent. The means of communication are different, and you can guarantee that at the end of the meeting, the 6 people that were in there, or at least 3 of them, will go off and make a coffee and then completely rewrite whatever the outcome of the meeting was, because they have the opportunity to do so. So I think hybrid is really difficult, and one of the analogies that I've used is it's a lot like the move to the cloud. So speaking very specifically to our audience, and this is, I was trying to explain this to Andrew, and I think he smiled and nodded and just accepted that what I was saying made sense. But for our audience, I think if I was looking at an organization that needed to transition from a data center to the cloud, the thing that I would say is, unless you absolutely have to, do not lift and shift your architecture into the cloud, because you get none of the benefits. It's actually just going to be more expensive. And it's a similar thing trying to move an organization to being hybrid, or to being remote. And if we consider that hybrid is harder, you have to re-engineer the organization, re-engineer the communication structures particularly. And that's what it's, for me, that's what it's all about. It's all about communication. So all of these things about social networks, decision making, conflict, trust, all of those things are really about communication. And if you just expect your large organization to transition to remote work and be effective at it, it's not gonna work without really considered thought. And I think that goes back to your first point. Why are they saying come back to the office? Because the necessary changes to the organizational structure and their processes weren't made to be effective, because GitLab can innovate, GitLab can be productive. The individuals in those teams can work together. Clearly, Amazon can't, perhaps because they haven't made the commitment to changing the organization.
Mm-hmm. So that's a fantastic analogy and a really good point. So we've seen cloud native firms, and now maybe we're seeing the rise of remote native firms. So we'll come back, I think, to some actionable insights that people can do if they do want to adopt remote work. We'll do that in a few moments. But I wanted to ask you one other thing on Amazon. Perhaps Andrew, this is one for you. We often talk in the IT industry about the tech talent shortage and how few skilled workers there are at certain levels. It's very likely, I would consider, that this is going to cost Amazon some jobs or some workers by forcing people back to the office. Do you think that they care because it's Amazon? Do they have difficulty recruiting? And if that is the case, will other companies who are also forcing people back to the office now benefit?
You mean will they benefit from
From
Amazon?
Amazon workers leaving Amazon?
Well, I think the conclusion that we've certainly drawn in our discussions when we've been using Amazon as a sort of springboard to discuss all of these things about the value of virtual work and how it relates to other forms, is that there's perhaps a little bit of a conceit in this agenda. And in a way, I suppose I go back to my point about that C-suite gaze, which is, are there other foreseeable consequences of putting such a black and white mandate on the table around about co-located, co-present work, 5 days in the office, that sort of thing, which is it's going to be so inconvenient and so inflexible to a certain proportion of your workforce that's going to move them out the door, and which would be a natural reduction in workforce that may be desirable. So it's in a way, it's a form of quite brutal organizational design, if you want to put it like that, which is to say, well, this is how we're going to do it, like it or lump it, and the result is that's the kind of person we're going to attract, is someone who's content to do that. Tech is not my area in terms of the kind of job market, but I'd certainly say if it's an incredibly competitive job market, you are potentially reducing your sort of addressable market if you're not willing to be flexible in that regard. It also may bias you towards a certain kind of demographic, a certain age group, and so on. So
I can jump into that because I've been hiring tech leaders all this year, and I mean, to answer your question about will other companies benefit, absolutely, Tom. So I mean, fundamentally, Amazon is a great business. It hires great people. I know a number of really, really impressive people that work within or have previously worked at Amazon. They do a great job at selection. They've got a really rigorous selection process. If somebody has been at Amazon, they've already passed a pretty high bar to get in. And now Amazon is selecting against people for characteristics which are not the quality of their work, but are rather their work preferences. So, and that's fine. They want people in the office. They will be left with the great people that they've hired that want to be in the office. That means there'll be a number of great people. This is not, performance related. There'll be a number of great people that want to work remotely. That's a net benefit to everybody else that wants those talented individuals. So for us, it's fantastic. And I've seen this year the easing of the market in the US. I've been hiring in the US this year. The easing in the market, the tech market, because of the redundancies and the shrinkage of the workforce of the global tech businesses, has been really beneficial. So this year I've been interviewing a huge number of really talented people that have had that type of experience. And as a smaller recruiting manager, it's been really beneficial for me. So the answer to that second part of your question is, yeah, absolutely. If you work at Amazon, and if you're a recruiting manager right now, then you should absolutely start looking out for that batch of Amazon employees that don't want to be co-located.
Great, okay. We're coming up to time now, so I want to ask both of you then, Mark, I'll stick with you for now, and then we can go over to Andrew, for your key takeaways, your actionable insights that IT leaders listening to this podcast need to take away from everything we've talked about on remote work.
Sure. I'm sure there'll be some crossover between Andrew and I. One of the things for me, and especially for a tech audience, is go and have if you haven't already, go and have a look at the GitLab handbook, because it's completely open and it does a great job of describing how to do remote work. But one of the key things that I found that is absolutely the most important is designing for asynchronous communication. And by that, what I mean is a meeting is synchronous. You get everybody together. which works when you're co-present, but it's actually a really big waste of time when you are virtual. And even more, if we talk about virtual teams that are geographically diverse, getting people together at the same time, because in theory, one of the big benefits is you can be fully globally remote, but it makes having a meeting at the same time, having a stand up at 9 o'clock London time is really difficult. So designing a way that you can have asynchronous communication, which is typically being documentation first, focusing on the documentation that can then be shared, is really important. Have a look at the GitLab handbook to explain more about that. And the second thing that I would say is about not forgetting to bring your team together. We mentioned this earlier, but there are some really, really important that there's actually, it's one of the things that the research bore out, is Microsoft research about the importance of social capital. And in that social capital, there are two types. There's the bonding capital that comes of being together in a team, and the bridging capital of managers connecting with other managers and other groups. The bridging capital is really important to innovation and to the interconnectedness of the organization. It degrades really quickly and much faster for managers than team members. One of the ways that you can invest in building that social capital is by bringing the team together for offsites, for away days, for work that really benefits from being co-located. So, I would say for me, there are those 2 points: asynchronous communication, redesigning the org for that, and then the second part is around taking time out of your normal work just to build that social capital.
Right. Okay. I'll drop a link for the GitLab handbook in the description for the podcast as well, so people can get to that ASAP. Andrew, your key takeaways then.
Yeah, I've got loads. I know we're limited for time. I think I would kick off going back to the our kind of topic of conversation around the Amazon and Andy Jassy announcement. Is the one thing it has in its favor is it's clear, and whether you like it or you don't like it, there is nothing in principle wrong with that approach. It just might be wrong for some individuals and indeed some teams, which, as I mentioned, the team is an important sort of unit. But that comes to the point of whatever your approach, it should be deliberate, reasoned. You should have clarity and be able to communicate with the logic behind it and that clarity. And it requires a bit of self-confidence and bravery, because you kind of have to nail your colors to a mast, and that is going to exclude some people in regard to their preferences and their way of working. So you have to be willing to take the losses, the collateral with that. But clarity is important. The other thing, I've mentioned it. Think about your level of analysis. So how is this going to affect people at different levels? And are particularly interested in teamwork. Teams thrive on agency and autonomy and being participants in determining their goals and objectives and their way of working. So if you have such a strong mandate that denies them that, then it's going to erode their ability to perform. So you have to be mindful of that. As I mentioned earlier, don't get stuck in a false dichotomy of mistaking, or comparing good in-person work with bad virtual work. And that comes onto my final point, which is that kind of deliberate, mindful approach. If you're doing, and it applies to both, it applies to co-present work and virtual work, but all organizations and all teams benefit from thinking about communication protocols. How do we communicate? Why do we communicate the way that we do? What is the format of the way in which we engage with each other that is optimal for performing well? I'd say we don't do that well enough at all when it comes to any virtual work. And we also tend not to be that great at it in person, actually, often enough, but we're certainly kind of generally better at it in person. And as I said earlier, we don't have to think about it so much in person, so it feels easier. But don't mistake it feeling easy with it being a better option necessarily. As Mark says, in person is really important. Having relational in-person contact is incredibly nourishing for teams, and you don't have to do it that often. I think a fully virtual team will see significant benefits from just deliberately getting together once a year, but make sure you do it.
Sure. Brilliant. All right. Mark, Andrew, thanks so much for joining me today on Control Alt Lead. I hope you've had a great time. I certainly have. And the audience will see you again very soon.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Tom.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Control Alt Lead. Coming up in future episodes, I'll be talking to ARM's Paul Williamson about AI at the network edge, and Richard Richardson of Repligen about why his company has ditched MFA. As always, you can head to computing.co.uk for more IT interviews, research, and analysis. See you soon.